Hi, first graders. Welcome back to writing. On Monday, you chose a special object to write about. You wrote an opening sentence to let your reader know what your book is about. And then you described what your object looks like and what it feels like. On Wednesday, you wrote more about your object. You described how you use it, where you use it, how it makes you feel, when you got it, and why it is special to you. Today, you are going to write a closing sentence. Then you will reread your book to make sure it makes sense, to correct any mistakes, and to make sure it sounds the way you want it to. You want to make sure that your book is the best it can be and that it is ready to share with your family and with your teacher. Before we work on closing sentences, think about whether you feel like you have written enough about your object. These are the questions that we explored on Monday and Wednesday. These give you lots of ideas of different things that you can describe, that you can write about to teach your reader about your object. Last week, we talked about how nonfiction writers often include closing sentences at the end of their books. Closing sentences let the reader know that they've come to the end of your book, that you are finished writing and teaching them about your topic. I looked back at some of the stories that my first graders wrote last year, and I looked at some of the closing sentences that they chose to write in their books about special objects. I wanted to share some of their ideas with you. One student finished their book by saying, "My favorite thing about my is." So if I used this closing sentence to write about my book, Winnie the Pooh, I might say, "My favorite thing about my book is that I love the stories." Or my favorite thing about Winnie the Pooh is that my mom gave it to me when I was young. Another closing sentence a first grader wrote last year was, "My object is special to me because." You might write, "I hope you enjoyed reading about my object." Or you could simply write, "I love my object." The best thing about my object is, you can tell the reader the best thing about it. Or you can come up with your own closing sentence that lets the reader know they've come to the end of your book. Think about what closing sentence you would like to add to your story. And then I'd like you to pause the video and write your closing sentence now. When we check our stories to make sure that they are the best they can be and that they are ready to share, there are a few different things that we check for. First, we reread our whole story to make sure that everything makes sense. We want to make sure that we didn't forget to write a word or we didn't write the wrong word. If our stories don't make sense, it makes it less enjoyable for the reader to read them. And then we read our stories to make sure that we put spaces between our words, that we checked our word wall and spelled our word wall words correctly, and that we used ending punctuation to end sentences and uppercase letters to start sentences. So we are going to do that now. And I will start by working on checking my story. I think that it is much easier to check stories to make sure they make sense by reading them out loud. By hearing our voices, it's easier to notice if something doesn't make sense. So I am going to do that now. I love my book, Winnie the Pooh. My book is old. The dust jacket is torn and is turning yellow. The cover of the book is made of red cloth. There is a picture of Winnie the Pooh. The inside of the cover has a map of 100-acre wood where the characters live. There are black and white drawings of the characters and their adventures on the pages of the book. I like to read my book in bed before I fall asleep. Reading Winnie the Pooh makes me feel calm. It belonged to my mom when she was young. She gave it to me when I was young. My book is special to me because I like the stories and because my mom gave it to me. When I read that out loud, I thought that every one of my sentences made sense. So I feel like I can say I am finished with that step, but now I am going to go back to the beginning of my story because I was really just focusing on whether the sentences made sense. And when I read it again for the second time, I am going to focus on whether or not there are spaces between the words and whether or not my word wall words are spelled correctly. And I'm going to look for ending punctuation in capital letters to start sentences. So I'm noticing right away that I have an uppercase letter at the beginning of my sentence. I have spaces between my words, and that I have ending punctuation. I'm also noticing that that's a word wall word that is spelled correctly. There's another my, oh, that one has an uppercase letter because it's the first letter of the sentence. Is another word wall word that is spelled correctly. So I am going to continue going through my story and checking for all of the things that are on this editing checklist. Your job now is to do the same thing, to read your story out loud and make sure that it makes sense. Then I want you to read your story again and check to make sure that there are not those mistakes like spaces or punctuation or uppercase letters that you need to fix to make your book the best that it can. Okay, first graders, if you have an opening sentence, you have described your object, you have a closing sentence, and if you reread your story to make sure that it makes sense, and you checked for mistakes using the editing checklist on the back of the writing paper, then congratulations, you have finished your story for this week. The last thing that you might want to do is continue working on your cover. So you saw me write my title and the author earlier this week. Throughout the week, I worked on an illustration of my book so that the cover gives the reader an even better idea of what my book is about. Now, I would like you to pretend like you are in the author's chair. It is time for you to share your story. Please use Seesaw to record your story so that your teacher can hear your great work. See you next week.